Hello, my name is Curtis Lockhart. I'm the founder and executive director of the Africa Urban Lab, or AUL. We're a policy lab housed at the African School of Economics, Zanzibar. At the AUL, we're focused on rapid urbanization across Africa and how we can harness that urbanization for economic growth. As part of this work, the AUL, we are excited to launch this new AUL working paper series. This working paper series, it highlights frontier research on some of the most important and impactful urban policy questions facing African cities today. And then given the AUL as a policy lab, we're also always interested in how this research translates into policy action in the real world. So part of the new AUL working paper series is that each published working paper will be accompanied by a virtual presentation on that paper from the authors, along with some questions from myself. And so that's why we are here today with two lovely guests who I'll introduce shortly. Our inaugural publication in the AUL Working Paper Series is titled The Economics of Greenfield Urban Planning, and it's by Vernon Henderson, Francisco Libano Montero, Martina Manara, Guy Michaels, and Tanner Regan. And for those interested in reading the paper, we have a link to it in this video's description below. So feel free to click through. To present this paper today, we have two of the authors, Professor Tanner Regan and Professor Martina Manara. Professor Regan, he is an assistant professor of economics at George Washington University, and Professor Manara is a lecturer in urban planning at the Bartlett School of Planning at the University College London. And the reason I should note before I hand it over to these two, the reason I love the work of these two and their co-authors is, as their respective backgrounds suggests, they do an amazing job at fusing together two disciplines that I feel and the lab feels are way too often siloed from one another, and that's urban economics and urban planning. So with that, Martina and Tanner, thank you both for joining us today.
Great, thanks, Curtis. That was a great introduction, and I think the main theme of this paper really corresponds with exactly what you just said. We're trying to bring together economists and urban planners, both through co-authorship, but also through the themes of this paper. And yeah, I should say, we're really excited to be, working with the Urban African Lab and presenting in this inaugural series. Let me share my slides.
And as you share your slides, Tanner, I'll just say for the listeners, just in terms of agenda, Tanner will be presenting here for about 15 to 20 minutes. I'll give him a flag at the 15-minute mark so he's aware. And then I will answer or ask, as I said, a few questions for both Tanner and Martina around the paper. So yeah, without further ado, Tanner, Martina, take it away.
Great. So, okay. And so this paper is called The Economics of Greenfield Urban Planning. So let me introduce this idea. So we want to start with this kind of contrast between the developed world and the developing world to kind of highlight, why it's interesting to think about the developing world in a slightly different way. So in developed countries, we kind of take planning for granted. Much of urban land in developed country cities is in public use, and even the private land is heavily regulated. Plots are clearly delineated. There's a lot of planning that is behind the scenes in developed country cities. In developing country cities, we have a very different picture in that these cities are largely unplanned. So you can get haphazard growth of the city. And this is, there's kind of a big economic problem with this in that if you let people settle in an unplanned way, it's going to be hard to implement important urban services ex post. And we can think about, two broad categories of services. First, public services like roads, water, and sewage. But also we can think of these kind of, more institutional services like property rights that are going to be really hard to establish if you let people settle before kind of delineating the space. The other kind of interesting aspect of the developing world and Africa in particular is that there's kind of this opportunity right now to plan in advance of settlement. And that's because these cities are growing very rapidly, right? So we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future, but we can take a look at the past decade. And about 100 million people have been added to sub-Saharan African cities between 2010 and 2020. And, it depends on what data you use, but, some estimates suggest that about 15 million of these people are on land that was not urban in 2010. Okay, so this kind of highlights the margin that we're going to be thinking about in this paper. How can we plan for those 15 million people, that are coming to these cities and settling on the kind of urban fringe? And the key policy that we're thinking about here is what we're calling Greenfield or de novo urban planning. The way this works is that on the urban fringe, the government will purchase land. It's going to be cheap because it's on the outskirts of the city, but because these cities are growing so much, we're expecting urban expansion to kind of grow into these areas. The government will take this greenfield land, partition it into formal plots, and provide some very minimal services. So in Tanzania, this is mostly just dirt roads. And then people can buy these plots and they're responsible for building their own homes. So this is kind of very minimal investment from the government, just acquiring this empty land and delineating the space is the main kind of intervention here. This is, we think this is an important policy tool to address those kind of problems that we introduced on the first slide. Right, this can help strengthen property rights by delineating the space. To begin with, it's a lot easier to get a property title when you have clear boundaries of your plot. And it can also kind of mitigate coordination failures of, otherwise haphazard growth where, people will crowd public spaces like streets or parks or other kind of public spaces. So that's the kind of upside of this greenfield urban planning. The kind of trade-off here is that, while there's those gains, there's also this kind of rigidity that comes from formality. And so what we're thinking is, the owner's rights are secured by that rigid cadastre, those are the property rights, but the fact that the cadastre is rigid makes it hard to change ex post. Right? And so it's going to be really important to kind of set this cadastre up in in an efficient way from the start, rather than thinking about, changing it later on. Okay, and so we're going to think about these ideas by studying a greenfield urban planning project in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania that was initiated around 2005. Okay, so let's just get in our, a picture in our minds of what we're talking about here. So this is one of these typical greenfield sites. This image is from June 2001. And this is one of the sites that the government picked in Dar es Salaam. And what we see is that in 2001, they planned some of the space on the top of the image. They delineated plots. They left space for roads. And if we fast forward to 2021, we can see how settlement then, expanded into this area. And big picture, what do we see here in the top half of the image? We see that properties obey the kind of plot delineations. All the buildings are kind of within their own property. They're not encroaching on their neighbors. And every single building has access to the road network. So that means if you want to provide services today, you can pave these roads, you can bring in piped water, you can bring in sewers, you can get emergency vehicles in there. Delivering urban services in the top half of the image is going to be much easier than doing that in the bottom half. Okay? So that's the kind of benefit to these greenfield urban policies. What we're going to think about in this paper is slightly different. We're going to look only in spaces that look like that top half of that image. And we're going to ask, how does the plan design within these planned areas affect economic outcomes? Okay, so let me be a little bit more precise about that. So we're going to think about first, this is economic speak, we're going to think about reduced form causal effects of planning treatments, right? So what are planning treatments? What we mean is, you can treat a piece of land with a plot size, right? You can treat a piece of land with a neighborhood density, so the plot sizes around that piece of land. You can treat it with proximity to planned non-residential uses, right? How nearby schools are, how nearby churches are, and other kind of geographic amenities. And so those are the treatments that we're going to think about. And then we're going to look at outcomes We're going to look at the transaction value of residential land. So we'll have prices of land. And we're going to use satellite images to look at housing investment and timing. So, how large is the building that gets built on your piece of land? When does that get built? Does it get built by 2020, which is kind of, our end line in this study? What I'm not going to talk so much about today, but is in the paper and is an important part of the paper, is we then kind of interpret these empirical findings in a simple structural model. And the purpose of this model, there's a few purposes, but kind of the key thing that we're going to do with this is we're going to try to think about counterfactual plan designs in these communities. So in particular, we're going to think about, what if the planners planned a completely different distribution of plot sizes in these planned communities? How would that affect welfare? How would that affect land values? And we're going to get the model to tell us what would be the distribution that maximizes welfare under our model assumptions, and what would be the distribution that maximizes land values, again, like under the assumptions of the model. Okay, so let's just get a little bit more into this kind of policy that we study. So this policy was all based in Dar es Salaam. It's called the 20K project. Its kind of initial title. Eventually it expanded, so it covers about 36,000 residential plots in Dar es Salaam. And there's 12 project areas. And you can just see on this image, the project areas are all on kind of the edge of the city. They're on the outskirts of the city of Dar es Salaam. Hey, about half of the space is residential plots. The other half is non-residential space. So that's roads, it's schools, playgrounds, and that kind of stuff. We can zoom in on one of these areas to see what it looks at the micro level. So this is a particular neighborhood. We have the satellite image in the back just to see what it looks like. But most of the kind of small rectangles here are going to be residential plots. Well, the large kind of polygons are going to be non-residential plots. So there's you can see some public building right in the center of this image. A lot of the non-residential plots are kind of empty fields. The other thing you can see in this image is you can see all the kind of road reserves, right? You can see the roads that add space between the residential plots. So what we're going to be focusing on is really those residential plots and looking at outcomes on those residential plots, thinking about treatments, plot size, the density of the residential plots nearby, and the proximity to these non-residential plots. If we look just at that residential space, here we can plot the distribution of plot sizes, of lot sizes. The planners had in mind this idea of high density, medium density, and low density. And we see that we have many plots in each of these bins, quite a few plots high density, which are 400 to 600 square meters, medium density 600 to 1600, 800 to 1600. And then we have 1600 to 4000 being the low density. So the key kind of thing to take away here is that these are quite large lots. Like even the small lots are fairly large. The low density lots are very large plots, right? So, for the American folks, 4,000 square meters is an acre. So 2,000 square meters is about half an acre lot. That's quite a big lot size. Okay, and this is the distribution that I mentioned in the structural model. We're going to think about shifting this distribution to maximize welfare, maximize land values. Okay, so what are the kind of key background findings? We find that all the plots sold very quickly, and through this, the government was able to cover the project costs. But if you look by 2020, when we have our data, only half of these properties were actually settled upon, right? So plots sold, but many people kind of waited to either resell or build later. If we compare our sites to nearby unplanned sites, the land values are about twice as high. So this is more kind of suggestive evidence, but again, it kind of points in this direction that there's some value in this planning. And then another key descriptive fact is we're going to find that the residents of these areas are very well educated. That's our proxy for wealth. So we get the kind of higher income folks are the ones that end up in these areas. We also see that the higher income folks are more likely to live on the large plots. Okay, so that's kind of the background descriptives. Our first key headline finding is that when we look at the land price of bare land on these residential plots, we find this kind of substantial decline in the price per square meter in lot size. Okay? So on the left-hand side here, we have again, these are our 500 square meter plots. As we move to larger plot sizes, the price per square meter falls. Okay. The kind of slope here corresponds to an elasticity of about, here it's negative 0.5. What that means is that, if you double the plot size, you only get 50% more value out of that in terms of land value. Okay, why is this so interesting for economists? This suggests that there could be some what we call misallocation in the allocation of land, right? If you can get more value out of the same piece of land by cutting it into 2 plots, you should do that rather than having one large lot that's lower total value. Okay, it's not necessarily true, so we're going to think about some alternative hypotheses, but at a first pass, this is very kind of suggestive of misallocation and a potential problem in these areas. Okay, we can also look at what happens to the settlement or the investment on this land. When we look at just whether the plot has been built upon, we don't find much of a relationship with plot size. So kind of small plots, large plots are equally likely to have been built upon by 2020. Instead, what we find is that if you look at the building intensity, so how much of the lot has been built upon, it falls like sharply with plot size. So essentially, roughly what's happening is people are building the same house, no matter what their lot size is. And, together with that price fact, this kind of suggests that, backyards are a bit of a waste in this context. Okay, so those are the kind of headline findings, 2 kind of robustness that are important, and we do a lot more in the paper, but this kind of highlights our robustness strategy. So what we do is a spatial regression discontinuity, and what we're going to do is we're going to look at roads that separate small plots on one side. So in this case, small plots are on the left side, and on the right side we have large plots. And the idea is, if you compare plots that are just on one side of the road versus just on the other side of the road, they face the exact same environment. So there isn't kind of omitted variables driving the kind of difference in outcomes. And we can say that the difference in outcomes across this road is driven only by the plot size. That's the argument we're making here. Okay? And so on the left-hand side, this is what it looks like when you cross a road from plots where the difference in size is less than 100 square meters. So we don't see any change in prices. On the right-hand side, this is what happens when you cross the road where the difference in plot sizes is more than 400 square meters. And here you can see this distinct kind of drop in the price per square meter when you move into those larger plots that are in the exact same place. Right? So this kind of is further evidence that supports those facts that we just saw. It suggests that our results aren't being driven by some omitted variable that's correlated with plot size. Okay. One more robustness. I said, that plots, the plot price with respect to size fact looks like it could be misallocation. But one alternative hypothesis is that the planners know that there's some social value of having large plots, right? This is a hypothesis. So it could be that people value being nearby large plots. So even though the large plots themselves sell for a bit less, they provide this positive externality. So maybe, in that sense, it's efficient. Okay, so we can try to test that. And the way that we do this is we're going to compare plots that are near that kind of boundary where the environment is mixed, right? Where there's large and small plots, to plots that are in the kind of center of a community where all the other neighbors are of similar size. Okay, so what we find is that as you move on a small plot from a place that has both large and small neighbors to a place that has only small neighbors, we find that those plots are slightly more likely to be built upon and slightly more intensively built upon. If you do the kind of same exercise on the large plot size, so you take a large plot in an environment where there's a mix of small and large and move into a location where it's more large nearby, we find no kind of relationship there. Okay, so why is this an important exercise? What it tells us is that there, first of all, isn't really much evidence that there are these spatial externalities of large plots, right? If anything, small plots are going to be, have more investment on them if they're near other small plots rather than being near large lots. Okay, so this is, one exercise, but the evidence that we have from this, if anything, kind of points in the opposite direction of this alternative hypothesis, right? It doesn't appear to be that there's this positive externality from large plots that would rationalize, having these low value large plots in these communities. Okay, so last set of facts. This is to do with, rather than the plot size and the neighboring plot sizes, this is to do with those non-residential plots and other amenities. So here again, we're always looking at outcomes on residential plots. We're going to find that those residential plots are less likely to be built upon depending on the kind of local geography. So if they're kind of further from the major roads that connect to the CBD, they're less likely to be built upon. If they're low elevation, they have rugged terrain, or they're near kind of rivers that are subject to flooding, they're going to be less likely to be built upon. We have some suggestive evidence that the kind of grid structure of the plan matters. So the more rectangular or the kind of more regular the alignment is of residential plots, the more likely they're to be built upon. This is, it's, it's another one of our kind of, findings here on amenities. The other kind of set of amenities we look here in the second bullet point is to think about, the planned non-residential land use, right? So is it, valuable to be near schools or near churches or near playgrounds? Here we find there's kind of really no relationship of the proximity to those non-residential uses and, outcomes on your residential plot. We look into this, much more in depth in the paper and basically show that it seems like the key reason is that despite having planned schools or planned non-residential uses nearby, there's very low implementation of these non-residential spaces. So often, the school hasn't been built by 2020. Okay, so let me summarize the big picture. So at the very beginning, we said, what we're really interested here in this paper is that planning can involve this trade-off between those kind of gains to resolving the coordination failures, establishing property rights, but also this ex post rigidity that it imposes. And that makes it important to get the kind of cadastre or the plan right from the beginning with some objective in mind. Right? What we saw empirically is that the planned land of these communities is about double nearby unplanned land. So that looks like there are gains from these projects. But if you looked within the planned land, the small plots are much more valuable than the large plots per square meter. And this suggests this kind of misallocation. Okay, what I didn't present on, but what is in the paper is that we have this structural model. And so we can use this to we can plug in those empirical results and use the model to interpret those empirical results. And the kind of key finding is that we find that reallocating the residential land at the very beginning, if we could go back in time, get the planners to reallocate land, where more of the residential land is allocated to small plots rather than large plots, we find that this increases welfare on kind of, by bringing in more people just in general, but it also brings in poorer people in particular. It gives more access to poorer folks. And so this is important. This increases welfare, but this is, this happens even though the model doesn't kind of put extra weight on poorer folks. And, as social planners, we might be quite, interested in helping the poor. So if you put more weight in the model on the poor, you'd find that we should have even smaller plots in these communities. Okay. Kind of one counter argument is what we talked about. There could be these kind of negative local spillovers of large plots, but at least in our analysis of our context, we find this not to be the case. So big picture, we think this paper will help inform how we should be planning these kind of expansion areas of cities in sub-Saharan Africa and the developing world. And we think there should be, first, just this recognition that we're making things rigid. And so we should really think ahead about how these places should be planned and how that will affect future outcomes. And in particular, we want the economists and the urban planners to be talking more, and hopefully urban planners can think about targeting some of these economic ideas about land prices in order to think about maximizing welfare going ahead. So thank you very much. I hope I was on time there.
Yeah, I think I think you're pretty bang on. So thank you so much, Tanner. And the presentation was great. Really interesting paper. So now, as I said at the beginning, we're going to move on to the Q&A part of the virtual presentation. So just firstly, this paper on the 20,000 plots initiative in Tanzania, I see it as a kind of extension, I guess, of a past paper that some of the same group of authors wrote called Planning Ahead for Better Neighborhoods. That's a paper published in the Journal of Political Economy back in 2021. So on this, how does this new paper on Greenfield urban planning complement or add to or extend this earlier paper?
Yeah, great. So that earlier paper was really about kind of what we took as for given in this paper, is that there's value in planning land rather than not planning at all. So that previous paper looked at World Bank projects in Tanzania from the 1970s and 1980s, these sites and services projects. And the main comparison was, if you plan land versus just leave it to develop in an unplanned way, how does that land compare 30 or 40 years later? And we find kind of very strong results that planning, improves the land, in that the land values are higher, people invest more on that land. The kind of public services that are built as part of the sites and services project are more likely to persist on the land that gets planned. So that first paper was really just about the value of planning as a whole. This paper is moving to think about, interior to these planned areas, how should the plan design look, right? So rather than just plan, no plan, how do you plan in an efficient way, right? And we have to kind of focus our research questions kind of narrowly, and we focus on what we think is one of the more important aspects of this, which is this kind of how do you plan the plot sizes on the residential space.
Okay.
Yeah.
This makes sense, and I had a I guess a brief follow-up question, because I know in that earlier paper it was mentioned that the World Bank kind of somewhat abandoned, I guess you could say, the sites and services program. It was a program popular in the, I believe, 70s and 80s, and it sort of abandoned in the late 80s, 90s. There seems to be some sort of resurgence happening in recent years, but it's this very similar program to this de novo planning approach you guys analyze in this 20,000 plots paper. So I'm curious, do you guys have an explanation for why the bank sort of somewhat abandoned this program, if what we see in some of your research, both this paper and past papers, is these positive outcomes over the medium to long term.
Right. So, so the World Bank keeps reports of all their old projects, and they're quite lengthy, but you can, read through them. And I think the kind of general theme, so each report is going to come up with all sorts of problems, but the general theme is that first, the kind of cost recovery of these projects were a challenge. So, for the kind of national or local governments to recover the costs of the sites and services projects was challenging from the individuals that were allocated plots. We saw in this case, this project that was implemented by the Tanzanian government, that this, was a success in the context that we study in this paper. So in that sense, it seems like they've kind of learned from those lessons of the 70s and 80s. So cost recovery, seems like it was dealt with well in this setting. Another kind of common story that comes out of the World Bank is that these areas are very slow to develop. And we see that again in this project, right? So like about 15 years after the project was initiated, only 50% of the plots were built upon. The previous study in Tanzania, it was hard to, for us to exactly measure, but it did look like it took, at least a decade before people start settling in these areas. So if you're like a policymaker and you've been waiting 10 years and it's still like these areas are still empty, it can be pretty frustrating, right? I think the kind of nice thing we have now is, with decades of kind of evidence, we can see that in the long run, the very long run, these projects are really beneficial. And then the third issue that gets raised is that the World Bank really wanted these sites to go to low-income people. And that really doesn't tend to be the case. And we think that our paper here at least starts to think about, what policymakers can do to try to alleviate this problem. The kind of policy response that doesn't work is to only allocate it to poor people, because then it gets resold and they don't end up living there. So instead, we think it's more about increasing the kind of scale of these projects, either by doing more of them or by reallocating the fixed amount of land that we have towards more small plots that allows more families, more households to access these areas. But the allocation to like higher income folks is still a challenge in our context in Tanzania. Yeah.
Okay, just one follow-up question here, and then Martina will get to you for a few questions. But so I guess related to a couple of the points, Tanner, you just brought up on the sites and services program. One was not recouping costs, and another that you mentioned at the end was, I guess, not targeting the poor, right? So your research basically shows that actually, yes, costs are more than recouped from these programs. But also, I guess your research does show, as you just pointed out, that the critique that sites and services or this 20K plots initiative, the critique that it does not target the poor is by and large a valid critique, right? And that wealthy households sort of self-sort into the treated areas. I guess in your paper, you guys focus on decreasing the plot size as a way to benefit more low-income and lower middle-income households. But I was thinking, I guess my response to this second critique on not targeting the poor would also be, well, if we pair this greenfield planning in urban expansion areas on the urban periphery alongside a land value capture instrument like a property or land tax, that this could largely address the second critique as well, in that given the self-sorting of wealthy households into these areas, an effective property tax on those wealthy households could then be spent, that revenue could be spent on public services for the common good that benefit low and low middle income households. That sort of strikes me as by definition kind of progressive and pro-poor. So I guess, Tanner, I know you've worked on property tax before. I guess number one, do you agree with the take I just laid out? And if so, why, in your view, hasn't either this 20K plots initiative or the sites and services type programs been paired with sort of property or land taxation?
So I think it's challenging. So I think in theory that makes a lot of sense, right? Like, yeah, you should tax the land that you're providing here, and that should be a nice like revenue source for the government to then subsidize future projects. Uh, the challenge is like doing that in practice, like the actual administration of this, because I think that is the law in Tanzania. Like all of this land has like a land rent associated with it. There's separately a property tax, but my understanding of Tanzania is a little bit more limited, and maybe Martina knows a bit more. But my rough understanding is that the land rent is kind of really low. There's a really low percentage of the actual value of the land, and mostly it's kind of like given up on as a policy because it's so hard to collect. Maybe like the places in the city center, they do a good job of collecting the land rents, but I think in much of the country it's hard to collect. And this is I can link this to my other work on property taxes. Is like you look around many cities in sub-Saharan Africa, compliance rates with property taxes are very low. So on the kind of in the order of like 10 to 15% of properties in many kind of cities where there's been studies where we know this, about 10 to 15% of properties are paying the property tax. So compliance is just a big challenge for the kind of administration of property taxes.
Okay, and I guess this is somewhat related to your Tanner, your answer of in theory, sure, but in practice, implementation is difficult. So maybe to you, Martina, as I mentioned in my intro, the lab, the AUL, we're a policy lab, right? So we're interested in not just frontier research that you guys and your team are conducting, but also in translating this research into policy action, so tangible implementation on the ground. And I know both of you were in Dodoma earlier this year presenting this research to policymakers. I was supposed to be there. I missed my train, so I could not make it, to my chagrin. But I wanted to ask you guys, what did you learn about the number one, I guess, demand for from urban policymakers for this type of evidence, this type of research? And then I guess more specifically, what are the next steps in terms of disseminating and implementing some of the policy recommendations stemming from this research?
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry you missed the train, but actually I must say that Tanner and I took the train for the first time from Dar es Salaam to Dodoma, and we thoroughly enjoyed it. It's so beautiful.
Great
and
train.
The landscape. Yeah, it's amazing. All right. Yeah. So we were actually pleased to find out that there was so much demand for policy dissemination on this project. I must say that we already had established link with the Ministry of Lands, particularly with the Directorate of Town Planning and Survey and Mapping. So we had a network to support our dissemination already in place. But then what we did is we connected with over 40 municipalities in Tanzania that are currently working to replicate the 20,000 plots project in Dar es Salaam, the one that Tanner presented on. They are at various stages of their implementation or even project design. So we actually learned a lot, discussed the potential for future research with these municipalities as well. But we were mostly pleased to say that not only they all showed up in Dodoma, but also they were thoroughly engaging with some roundtables and discussions on what would be the implementable takeaways from the work that resulted in some policy briefs. They're really keen to know how they can design these projects better. So the fact that and really hopeful that we would show more counterfactuals, like literally they have very concrete questions like, so what should be the plot size? How many small or large plot we should have? During our stage of collecting information, the pre-engagement survey that we administered to all these municipalities, we found out that out of the 62,000 plots that they are currently developing, 42% are high density, but still they are in the range of 300 to 800 square meters. So meaning quite large still, given the evidence that we presented. But they're at different stages of implementation. So for sure, there is room to implement some of the findings. Although I must say something very surprising for us was also to understand that they have further problems that the 20K of Dar es Salaam didn't have. For instance, in these cities that are secondary cities, sometimes newly emerging cities, they're encountering challenges of even selling these plots and so recuperating the money, which then takes us back to the point of the original critique to the World Bank Sites and Services strategy. So there is this extra issue, or there is another issue because nowadays even the the governance of these projects is very different from what it looked like 20 years ago when the 20K project was designed by the Ministry of Lands and then handed over to the municipalities, whereas nowadays it's much more a collaboration from the outset with the town planning departments of the municipalities, how to do this collaboration, how to collaborate with the landowners who in many cases are not willing to release the land. So they also forced us to reflect to new questions that we are still in the process of digesting and discussing for future research. It's what we want to do in the future, to collaborate with governments in the stages of project design and implementation. This is also a nice space for trialing different alternative approaches, but it takes time. So I'm currently unable to tell you this is where we're headed.
Okay, good to know. And I guess this next one is for both of you. So I just wanted to zoom out for a second here. So the Africa Urban Lab, we're really interested in urban policies that can help African cities harness rapid urbanization for economic growth and for structural transformation. So beyond, I guess, one of the main recommendations stemming from this particular paper that Tanner went over is lowering minimum plot sizes. But beyond that particular policy, which this working paper suggests, what are some other urban policies that you two see as having big potential to help unleash the power of cities for growth? And are you or your collaborators, are you guys looking into any of these for future research?
Martina, do you want to?
This is a test for Tanner and I to see if we're on the same page. So you might be destroying a long-term relationship. You got Tanner, you go first.
Yeah, so to go like big picture, I think and this idea of like structural transformation, where we think the agricultural sector in the developing world is like less productive, where the urban sector is more productive, wages are higher in the urban sector. There's this idea that you can move people from agricultural areas to urban areas, and maybe that will raise aggregate productivity. So that's the kind of idea in the background. Then the question is, well, why, if wages are so much higher, why aren't people going there? Right? We think there's some spatial equilibrium in the background. And so I think a lot of the research is focused on, the kind of agricultural side of this, like, how can you, I don't know, fix the agricultural areas and release people from the land so they can move to cities. But a big kind of missing part of this research, I think, is like the urban side, right? And so another kind of way you could think about this is making cities more like attractive places to live, right? Lowering the kind of costs of density. And so, Curtis, I think that's your question, is like, what could actually like lower the cost of density to, encourage people to move into these cities that are productive places? Okay, well, so we like this kind of idea of urban planning. We think, planning and housing is important. It's very high level, but improving the transportation infrastructure is another big one that's going to make these cities more livable. Maybe another one that's kind of, I think, needs more research. So there's a lot of research on transportation in cities, but like the sanitation infrastructure, the water infrastructure within cities, I think we could have more research on that. I think that those are like other promising ways to make these cities much more livable. That's very high level, but I think those are kind of like, three key dimensions: housing, transportation, and the kind of sanitation infrastructure are three big, dimensions that will make cities more livable in these places.
Martina, we'll see if you guys are aligned.
Yeah, so just no, we're fine, don't worry. So yeah, adding one thing, in fact, Tanner and I are starting with a collaborator project on in situ rehousing, which is one policy that is potentially very helpful in that sense, because by not moving people elsewhere, it doesn't break up the connections that people have with the local market or their social connections in general, which we know are important for economic outcomes. On top of that, I would also want to mention the fact that we do think, I think I can speak for both of us, that it is important to understand more the institutional transition that is coming with this urban transformation. Tanner gave some data earlier about the billion people that have reversed in cities in just the last million people in the last 10 years. And so, what does it mean for the governance structures, the coordination structures that are already in place locally? So we are very much interested in finding more about the institutional restructuring that comes with urban transformation, because we do believe that the institutions that are in place are also fundamental for economic growth and equal growth. And then, of course, like land policy, I would say most of our research has been about land policy. Land is central to that. If the institutions on land ownership, land use coordination, and so on and so forth are either unclear or weak in general, however, this is defined, and it can be defined in many different ways across contexts. The point is that there is the knowledge and capacity infrastructure in place to make policies and implement those policies. So we are really active in terms of research on land. So in the future, we were considering maybe expanding research on land adjustment policies, land pooling, land sharing, all sorts of policies that can facilitate planning, not just in terms of planning design, but in terms also of planning enforcement, because it should be noted, which is another important finding from our research on the 20K project, that planning has these two dimensions that can be quite separate and go in like orthogonal to each other. Unfortunately, on one side, regulation can go in one direction, but then enforcement is something else in most cases. And land and the land institutions are foundational to that.
So this is a good segue to the last question, this point you brought up, Martina, on the centrality of land policy, right? So Tanzania has an election at the end of this month, October 29th. President Samia, she just launched earlier this year revised national land policy, and it looks like, as kind of a follow-on to this revised national land policy, it looks like land mapping and land digitization will be a key priority of a new administration after the election. Historically, I think most, I should say, attempted land reforms, they often run the risk of being, if not captured, then at least undermined by incumbent elites. And so I wanted to ask, from both of your experiences, so this is to both of you, and maybe Martina, you can go first. Have you seen effective ways to avoid capture, or at least like reduce capture or elite resistance to these types of land reforms or urban policy reforms?
Yeah, that's a great question. So before I even attempt answering to your question directly, I would like to go back in history a little bit, to the history of land reform in Tanzania. I would say that despite this new national land policy, in practice, Tanzania has always led the way of property reform in sub-Saharan Africa, initially in the 1990s, but then also in the last 10 years, probably land registration, land mapping, and digitization have been at the forefront of their national policy almost continuously. So I would call this moment a continuation of what has been a real emphasis on the importance of land policy. Just to mention a couple of examples, like their 5 years development plan of 2021-2026 was already highlighting the centrality of land reform in order for the country to reach their independence and also financial autonomy, because obviously land, as we mentioned before, can bring a lot of revenue to a state. But also lately, like in December 2021, I think, the Ministry of Land signed this project called the Land Tenure Improvement Project, where they were receiving 115 million USD from the World Bank, which has subsequently been cut. But still, it gives us a sense of the investment and big efforts that this government have always been doing to digitize, map, and survey and plan land in general. However, yes, it's true that often these land reforms come with the risk of elite capture, but more generally, I would call it, for the Tanzanian case, conflicts of interest within the government itself about what are the forms and ultimately the gains from this land reform. And I would like to mention one aspect of that is maybe slightly understudied or less understood, which is the conflict of interest that this type of reform may trigger between even the national versus the municipal level of governance, for example, or government, because there are tensions when it comes to a context where the Ministry of Land is responsible for registering the land, giving permission to occupy the land, and collecting revenue, whereas municipalities are those responsible for planning the land. And therefore, we have seen in some of my other work, a lot of tensions that come when municipalities, Ministry of Lands may not necessarily be aligned in their priorities of where should the land be regularized or planned or surveyed, etc. And sometimes even between government agency like road authority, sanitation agencies, or water authority, for example, and other government agencies, because the plans that they rely upon for extending the road network, the water network, and so forth may not be aligned with the new strategies of planning and surveying and registering the land, posing new conflicts that necessarily delay the process and sometimes even trigger further tenure insecurity. So obviously land reform is like a very muddy terrain where a lot of actors and interests start fighting one another. So it's a very complex and long journey. I don't have a better answer, I'm afraid. Maybe Tamir has. That's why
I'm excited that most of your work, a lot of your work takes place in Tanzania. So I'm living here in Zanzibar in Tanzania. So at least I get to ask you over time and check in on this question, because I think it is, as you said, Martina, a really central question. Tanner, over to you. Same last question that Martina just answered.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I'm an economist, so I'm going to think about things a little bit more abstractly. And in that sense, I have a lot less to say about specific policies, but I can point towards, an old paper of mine on Nairobi. And so it's Kenya, kind of a different land history than Tanzania, right? There's been a lot of conflict over land in Kenya. And in a nutshell, like what is that? Our paper looks at slums in Nairobi and tries to think about, whether the land that slums are on is kind of, misallocated again. And the key kind of mechanism that we think is happening in Nairobi is that there are these kind of well-connected slumlords who don't have the formal ownership of the land, but are able to like use their political connections or their business connections or what have you. They're able to influence so that they can exert control over these slums and extract rents, basically, right? They'll collect the rents from hundreds of thousands of people that, even though they're living in these kind of shanty towns, the land is valuable and there's many folks living there, so they're able to like extract a lot of rents from them. The point of our paper is to say that even though there's this kind of incumbency problem of these politically connected slumlords, the kind of the value of the urban land is so large that the gains to reform, and here's where I'm an economist, so I'm not suggesting any particular policies, but in you could think that the gains are so large that you could just pay the value of the rent extraction to the politically connected folks. Like, that's not a great political solution, but that would make them kind of indifferent with the status quo and this land reform, and there would still be, the gains are so large, there'd still be gains left on the table to share with the residents, share around the country, more broadly. So how you actually do that in practice, I'm like nowhere near like being able to tell you, but I think the key point of that paper is that there is a lot to be gained from this land reform. There's enough to kind of make everyone, at least as well off.
Great. I think that's a good place to end. That's all the questions I had. So I'll just end by saying, as I said at the beginning, I'm Curtis Lockhart of the Africa Urban Lab. You can learn more about the AUL's work at www.aul.city, and you can find this working paper on the website as well. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, or you can follow us on Twitter at Africa Urban Lab. So thank you, Martina and Tanner, for a great kickoff to the AUL working paper series. Thanks so much.